Terminology can be confusing. Oftentimes, this is the result of different sources using terms differently. In some cases, however, people will pick up two different terms and start to blend them together, and this can cause confusion. This is the case with the terms dimension and density in the New Age movement. While these terms don't necessarily have their roots in the occult, they can be helpful when having occult discussions. To help get onto the same page as to what's a dimension and what's a density, we'll discuss each of them, starting with dimensions. Dimension most commonly refers to the location of a person, place, or thing at a specific point in time. If something was to have 0 dimensions, we could visualize that as a single point, or a dot. It exists, but it doesn't exist in any particular place. One dimension is represented by a line, most commonly referred to as length. This can be looked at in one of two ways. Either you can think of this as the place upon which something exists, if you had a line upon which you could plot it, or you could look at it as the shape that something in one dimension would take, that of a line, having a particular length. Two dimensions can be represented by an x and y axis or by a square. You can look at this in the same two ways. You can either use the x and y axis to plot the location of something. It can be a certain distance to the right or left and a certain distance up or down. Or you could use this as a representation of what an object might look like in 2D. For example, a square. Objects in 2D have both length and width. Three dimensions can be represented by an x, y, and z axis, giving you length, width, and depth, or by the cube, representing what something would look like if it had length, width, and depth. Now, in some models of dimensions, this is where the model ends, because in some models of dimensions, we only talk about space. In others, we include time as a component, and those will add a fourth and fifth dimension to this, with the potential of a sixth. To understand those models, we have to go back and look at first, second, and third dimension again, but with an added component of time. In the first dimension, when we looked at the line, this was representing length at a particular point in time. It's the length of something at that time, or it's where along this line something existed at a particular point in time. The key here is that it's at a point in time. It's like a snapshot or a picture. In the second dimension, we now have a square, or we have something plotted along an x and y axis at a specific point in time. Once again, it's a snapshot, a point in time. At the third dimension, we have something plotted along the x, y, and z axis, or we have a cube or similar three-dimensional shape that existed as this at a particular point in time. Once again, a point in time. So when we get to 4 dimensions, we're not actually adding upon the dimensions of space that have now reached 3 with the cube. We're adding to the dimensions of time. It's possibly better to say that we're not at 4th dimension, but rather we're at 3 dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time, whereas before we were at 3 dimensions of space and no dimensions of time. When you add 1 dimension of time, you make time into a line, the same way you did with space previously. A timeline will usually count from the past to the future, and where something exists along that line is how you plot it. So a 4th dimensional object has length, width, depth, and a point along a timeline that it exists. To see something in its full 4-dimensional form, you would see it across all of its length of time, which would look kind of like looking at a movie frame by frame, but having the frames split out in front of you, so you could see everything that was going to happen from beginning to end. When we talk about our own reality, we actually plot points in 4 dimensions. We give a location based on a 3-dimensional space at a particular point on the timeline. Finally, we get into the 5th dimension, which would be the same as saying 3 dimensions of space and 2 dimensions of time. When we do this, we can draw time as if it has an XY axis or as if it is a square. So now you're plotting yourself on something more than just a timeline. Many people have proposed that the one line represents the time from past to future, and the other line represents possibilities or alternate timelines. And this is how someone would be able to see future potentials. They look ahead on the timeline, and they look around at the different possible outcomes, and as a result, they're able to come up with what's most likely to occur for the timeline that they're in. This, of course, is all theoretical in nature, but this would be what 5 dimensions represents. Some people also believe that there's a 6th dimension, which would be 3D space and 3D time, but a real understandable model of that doesn't exist as far as I've been able to find. So that, in a nutshell, explains dimensions, the location of a person, place, or thing in relation to space and time. Now, there are a lot of people in the New Age that will use the term dimension, but it doesn't seem to mean what we just spoke about. In those cases, what they're actually talking about is density, and density and dimension are not the same thing, though the terms are often used interchangeably now. So we'll get into density so you know what many of them are talking about right now. Please keep in mind we're not using the scientific version of the word density, which means the degree of compactness of a substance. I'm not sure why this same word was chosen to express this idea, but density is the word that's used, so density is the word we're going to go with. So what is density for the purposes of this theory? To many in the New Age, density denotes vibrational frequency. That is to say that whenever we vibrate on a different frequency, we are of a different density. So you might almost be able to better call this vibration or resonance, but the term density is what's used the most. Through my own research, as I've tried to figure out how to better explain this, how to better understand it myself, the conclusion that I came to is that densities really represent phases of consciousness or belief structures. That whenever you reach a certain level of consciousness, you move to a different density. It might, for our purposes, be better to call these things simply levels of consciousness. That would make them a lot less confusing. But again, density is the term used, so we'll stick with it. So you can see here a diagram that represents different densities, starting out with a dot and moving out to circles around that dot. You probably notice the similarities between this and different diagrams for the planes, such as the material, astral, causal, and mental. This same type of theory works whenever talking about the planes as it does whenever talking about density. Many people who talk about density say that we are either in the third density or fourth density now. You can see how this is easily confused with dimension, because people who talk about dimension will either say we're in the third dimension or fourth dimension as well. However, density and dimension are not the same thing. Something that exists in the first density has existence and the adherence to natural laws. It is a thing, but it doesn't necessarily have any level of consciousness above its simple beingness. Examples of this would be matter, atoms, things we consider to be inanimate, elements, molecules, many single-celled organisms, things like that. Something on the second density has survival instincts of one nature or another. Plants all exist on what we would consider to be the second density, as do most animals that are not self-aware, such as insects, many fish, arachnids, etc. Third density is represented by emotion and self-awareness. Now, self-aware animals fall into the third density, and so do humans. You can almost think of each of these densities as having a spectrum, from a low vibrating entity within that density to a high vibrating entity within that density, and you would call a human a high vibrating third density. So it's easy to understand the first, second, and third density as the simple state of being, the state of survival and instincts, and the state of emotion and self-awareness. You can see how something that is of the third density encompasses everything that is of the second and first density, and all of this is pretty easy to follow up to this point. So what is fourth density? Fourth density is often described as ESP, connectivity, astral perception, things like this. They're what we would consider to be the next step in evolution of our consciousness, of our mind. And so an example of something that would exist in the fourth density would be a self-actualized psychic entity. Now, some of us believe that we ourselves are becoming self-actualized psychic entities, and this is done through practices like meditation and any other form of self-actualization. Some of us believe that ESP and connection to each other can be achieved with enough practice, and this is sort of where we're getting with all of this. People who believe in these densities believe that there is the potential to move into a higher density, and that the next density that we as a human race would be moving into is this fourth density, the ability to become a self-actualized psychic entity. Those of us who speak to entities using methods like evocation and invocation often believe that we are speaking to fourth density entities. A fourth density entity would theoretically have all of the first, second, and third density elements within itself, but with the added fourth density elements. As to why we can't see these fourth density entities, that's not something that I fully understand, although some of us believe that some humans are fourth density entities, so it may not be related to density whatsoever. Though many in the New Age would say that a low vibrating fourth density entity would be a psychic human, whereas a high vibrating fourth density entity would be something like what we can channel and speak to, and those entities are such a different vibration that we're unable to see them. It's almost as if they're out of phase. I'm not sure where my belief falls in this spectrum, but that is what is most commonly used whenever speaking about the fourth density. Now from there, you get concepts that build this up to a fifth density, concepts that build it to a seventh, concepts that build it to 12, concepts to build it to 13, etc. But it's pretty obvious that even though we might be able to conceive of a fourth density that we're moving into, conceiving of the even higher ones would be pretty difficult. So I don't put a lot of stock into what would be a fifth or higher density, although it's pretty commonly accepted that a fifth density is a unified existence of some sort. Theoretically, a global consciousness, or something greater than that. The idea that we might all, as humans, begin to see ourselves as a single human element would be a fifth density construct. Also, the idea that we might resonate with the planet and see the planet as the whole as us would be a fifth density viewpoint. Now, as to whether these densities are a real thing or they're just conceptual, or whether they actually represent psychological states of being, such as the use of the part of our brain that is for survival compared to the part for emotion, etc., that's for the individual to decide. But the purpose of this video was to help explain what people mean when they say things like, we are fourth dimensional beings getting ready to go to the fifth dimension, or we are third density beings getting ready to become fourth density. You'll probably hear this a lot if you travel in New Age circles. If you want to be fully well-rounded on what everyone involved in these practices is doing, you'll probably end up in the New Age area at some point. And that's why understanding these concepts is valuable. I hope you found this video helpful or interesting in the very least, and until next time, safe travels. Thanks for watching. If you liked that video, please click like and subscribe if you'd like to see more videos of that type. Click the bell icon next to subscribe if you'd like to be alerted when new content is available. If you're interested in learning about the fundamentals of magic, I've got a 56-part lecture series available in the playlist section of my channel that can also be linked to in the top left corner of your screen. Or if you want more videos like the one you just watched, the playlist for that is linked to the top right of the screen. All of the videos I make are sorted in the playlist section of my channel. That's the easiest way to navigate it if you're looking for something. Your support is appreciated, and I give you the greatest of gratitude and thanks. And until next time, safe travels.